the button, so it's being recorded. I want to thank everybody for coming and look forward to discussion with you today. I passed out agendas. For those on the phone, the agenda is posted on our rulemaking webpage if you want to follow along, and copies of the comments are on that webpage too. And I do want to thank, in particular, the people who submitted written comments on our second draft. It was great to have those, and I think it'll help us narrow the range of topics quite a bit to have those written comments. For those of you on the phone, as noted on the agenda there, if you could send an email to that address that's listed there, eia@commerce.wa.gov, I can make sure that you're added to the attendance list for this session. And those of you in the room, if you haven't already, please sign in. So let's do some introductions first, and we'll go around the room here, and then we'll catch the people on the conference bridge. Michelle, would you start us?
Sure. I'm Michelle Patterson with Mason County PUD 3.
John Roslin with Avista. David Nightingale, Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission.
Zach Giannis, Snohomish PUD.
Jessica Mitchell, Snohomish PUD.
David Shepard-Gaw, Cowlitz PUD.
Larry Blofkus, Clark Public Utilities.
Norm Goodlaw, Lewis County PUD.
Luke Canfield, Lewis County PUD.
Rich Arneson, Tacoma Power.
Diana Carlin, I'm a contract lobbyist for Cowlitz PUD, Lewis PUD, and Tacoma Public Utilities.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And on the phone, Andy, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, Andy Osbjornson with the State Auditor's Office.
Eli?
This is Eli Morris, Pacific Power.
Elizabeth?
This is Elizabeth Osborne, Northwest Power and Conservation Council Washington staff and Washington Energy Office.
John? Francisco?
Francisco with Inland Power and Light.
Kevin?
Kevin Smith, Northwest Power and Conservation Council.
Linda?
Linda Esparza, Franklin PUD.
Matthias?
Matthias Jarvagren, Clallam County PUD.
Sandy?
Sandy Edgman with Richland Energy Services.
Ted?
Ted Light, EES Consulting.
And Tom? Tom Schumacher? Tom may be muted, but it looks like he's signed in. And Brendan, I think maybe you joined us. Brendan, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, this is Brendan O'Donnell at Seattle City Light.
All right, excellent. Did I miss anybody on the bridge?
Yeah, Glenn, this is Wendy Gurlis, Northwest Energy Coalition.
Oh, hey, Wendy. Good to have you on. Anybody else?
Nicole Hughes, nonpartisan staff, OPR.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. All right, so I did pass out an agenda, and for those of you on the phone, I've got it put up on the screen, but if you want your own copy, you can find it on the rulemaking webpage. There were a couple of issues that I wanted in particular to talk about, and then I've left a spot on the agenda for people to raise other concerns that they either wanted to emphasize from their own written comments or comment on based on what they read other people saying. So in this section 2 on discussing the comments, in the first 2 sections I've laid out a little bit of language for us to work with. So it's not exactly what any one comment proposed, but it's kind of a working draft that we can use as we're talking about that particular topic. And then you'll see there's a couple of others where there's not any working draft language like that. Those are maybe a little bit more straightforward issues where we can, we don't need a lot of language to get at the points we want to make. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we dig into the individual issues? Housekeeping stuff, I forgot to mention that, but the restrooms are back toward the elevator, but on the opposite side of the hall. There's a water fountain there too. There's on this floor we have a nice little open area if you need to step out to make a phone call or something like that. There's space there. There are even a couple of little phone rooms that you'll see that you can step into if you need to make a conversation where you're going to be screaming at somebody. So, or if you're going to be crying while someone screams at you. Either one. I use them all the time. And those of you on the phone, you'll have to make your own arrangements. I'm sorry. Okay, anything else? All right, let's talk first about this question of using utility-specific inputs. I think, you know, it seemed like there was consensus among all the commenters that that was something that was appropriate, that utilities are entitled to do that as part of their planning process. Welcome, additional guests. I'll let you guys introduce yourself once you get settled. So anyway, it seems like there's consensus about that fact, and I think even about the fact that it ought to be expressed in the rule. I know that there's been some view that, well, we don't need to say that because it says it in the statute, things like that. But it seems like there's a lot of support for adding that sentiment to the rule. So this was synthesis type language that I came up with. You know, I think one thing that we do need to try to balance in this is, well, a couple things. One is the responsibility that utilities will have to make reasonable inputs where they're using their utility-specific inputs, and to, you know, show the auditor how they got to the inputs or the assumptions that they did. And the other is the kind of the role of global type inputs versus utility-specific inputs. And you know, I think if the input was like, well, how many outdated electric furnaces are in your service territory, that's obviously utility-specific input. But at the other end of the range might be a market price forecast or the social cost of carbon, things like that, that it may not be quite appropriate to have a utility-specific input. And so we tried to incorporate that idea that it is a mix of the specific and the general that goes into that. Let's take a pause just for a second to let our two new guests introduce themselves.
Nicholas Garcia, Tacoma Power, and Lisa Rennie from Tacoma will be joining us shortly.
Liz Clump with Bonneville.
Thank you. Welcome, both of you. So anybody want to jump in on this first item on utility-specific inputs?
Glenn, this is Richard.
Hey, Rich.
Could you kind of talk us through what you would mean by general characteristics of the Northwest?
I think it could be markets that exist, you know, where there are opportunities to either buy or sell things with other utilities. It could be some of the non-energy benefits that might be quantified. Those could be things that aren't specific to a utility. And in some cases, the utility may use those regional values essentially as a default, where that's the best information they have, is not their own specific information, but a number from the RTF or some source like that.
So just further clarification, here it says, and the general characteristics of the Pacific Northwest Power System. And I guess the question I would have is, if the utility specific characteristics either are at odds or at least are not aligned with the general characteristics of the region, in your mind, can the utility use its own characteristics in this process?
Yeah, that's the idea that I have, that they would, where it reasonably reflects their own specific characteristics, that's what they would use in their assessment, and they would show the auditor that it was reasonable to do that.
Okay. So should the language be and or?
No. I mean, and or is just a confusing thing that I would, because and you never know. Well, is it and or is it or? Do both conditions apply, or is it a choice? So you're not going to get an and or out of me, David.
Thank you.
Nightingale might give you that at the UTC, but you don't want to go there.
Well, I mean, the way I would read it is that you need to, because it says and,
Need to do both.
if there are any utility-specific things, you need to use those. That's the way, if I were a utility, I might interpret it that way.
Yeah, right.
Is that the intent of the language?
No, I think that's right. And I mean, and we did play around a little bit with trying to say one was more important than the other, or one was the default, or whatever. And it seemed like it was a more straightforward statement to say that the utility ought to be looking at all of that as it comes up with the inputs and assumptions that it's going to use. And it's not that one trumps the other, unless, I mean, until there's a good reason that one trumps the other.
So should there also be a state aspect or perspective? I mean, if we're going to be talking about carbon, states are going to have their own perspective, right, as it relates to that value?
I don't know. It's what the idea that there were, I mean, there certainly are state-specific inputs that you end up using, you know, like sales tax is different in Washington than Oregon, things like that. But I don't know. Any other thoughts on that, or?
I think in the statute it says to consider Washington policy, I think, somewhere. And, you know, to the extent that, for instance, on carbon issue, that there's a state preference to do something. That would, I don't know if it goes here, but there is that in statute that is sort of broad brush. It's specific to Washington.
And that's not the Energy Independence Act statute that you're thinking of, or is it?
It is. Yeah.
Oh, it is. Okay. Anything else on this? I guess that, did you have?
Yeah, I guess conceptually, I would have to justify, a utility would have to justify why its assumption is different than the council's assumption.
Well, see, I mean, that's what we were trying to steer away from. So not saying, you know, like, use one unless you can prove the other kind of language. It was that your inputs need to reasonably reflect both local and regional characteristics. So I don't think that, you know, one takes precedence over the other under this language. Does that make sense, or do you feel like there should be a default one way or the other?
I don't want to get caught in the position where we're having to justify something as simple, maybe not as simple, something like a power price forecast, why it's different than what the council used, or an assumption on a depreciation rate, or an assumption on a weighted average cost of capital. And it seems like this particular language doesn't clarify what is and isn't reasonable, and who reasonable in the eyes of whom, right? Because at the end of the day, our at least for the publics here, our boards are saying, yeah, you generally did your math right or not, and we're willing to adopt that plan. So it kind of opens up, just the way I read it right now, it's kind of open-ended and it's not really clear. Reasonable in the eyes of whom and what.
Andy's on the phone. Maybe he can say something from the auditor's office.
I think it's a good question. You know, each utility would be unique in determining those. We'd look for just support in the inputs used. I can't really answer the question about reasonable and what would or would not be reasonable. I think we'd just be looking for the support to see what was used and how that applies from the utility's perspective.
Rich, did you have?
Yeah, this is Rich to comment. I mean, you know, I started been rereading this a couple of times here, and my takeaway is it's not saying that we have to use power council assumptions. You know, it's saying, you know, my read is it's you know, maybe things that are outside the utility but affect the, you know, the Northwest. So, you know, your price forecast is outward looking, you know, to outside your service area. But it's not necessarily pointing to the power council assumption per se. It's my read. So,
but I think the point that Zach's making, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Zach, is that you're going to have a forecast of future prices, and we're going to have one, and every other utility is going to have one. They're not going to be exactly the same. I guess my thinking, having worked with the state auditor's office a couple of times, is that, you know, if you're in a kind of a band that everyone else is in, it's probably not going to be an issue. But, you know, if your costs were here and if everyone else's costs were here and yours were, you know, substantially less, they would want to know why. Or if I was them, let me put it that way, if I was them, I would want to know why. And, you know, it gets back to, do you have a reasoned, well-reasoned purpose for that different number? And I can give you an example from us, is that because of our load growth or absence thereof, we're going to be using our Bonneville contract as our avoided cost. We're not going to be using market, and Bonneville's higher. So, you know, if that question comes up, we're going to say, well, here's the price forecast for the market, but we're going to be using this number. Generally, that means we're going to be getting more conservation, so that's probably not going to end up being a problem. But likewise, if I can envision a similar circumstance where it would be below, and as long as we have a good reason, my observation working with the state auditor's office is that, you know, that's justification. But do you have to prove it? You know, it's a stand. You know, there's not like a hard fast standard, I don't think. And I don't know if you want to put one in, because then the rules get awfully complicated.
maybe removing the word reasonably.
Yeah. I think that there is a burden on the utilities to be able to say why they used an input that they did, whether it's their own or one that they adopt from the Power Council. So I'm not very open to the idea that you don't need a reason to make the assumption that you did. I mean, I can imagine there'd be, this idea of absolute autonomy, that you don't have to justify it, but that's not the environment that I see this operating in.
Glenn,
Yes, Nicholas.
the one other thing I would mention is that the council does a plan every 5 years, and so if you're in year 4 of the 5-year plan, you could probably say these numbers are outdated. And the level of justification needed to say, hey, we're using a different number probably would be less than if it was, the same year that the plan came.
I think that's a good observation. Yeah.
Yeah, we actually did that last time with the 7th plan assumption before it was out, because the RTF had approved a lot.
And at that point, a lot of forward-looking work had been done, so you went ahead and used it.
Right.
Yeah, because it was better than the 6th plan work from 2010, or really 2008 or whatever. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Any further thoughts on this one? Or, and after the meeting today, you'll have an opportunity to say, well, change this word or change that word or whatever. So I'm not closing the door on all comment on this, but if we got enough on this one, we can move to the next. Nicholas?
I do have one last question.
Sure.
In the last, in the last meeting we had, there was some discussion about the interest rate we used to discount, and whether it needed to be basically the council's number or a utility number. Have you come down on the side of that yet at this point?
We that'll be agenda item 2D. So it's a couple down.
Oh, a discount. I'm sorry, I did not see that. Sorry.
And I didn't. For those of you who arrived late, I offered a little explanation for what these little indented text paragraphs are. Those are synthesis language that I came up with after reviewing the written comments. So it's like a working draft language. And I don't have those for the carbon cost and discount rate. So, but anyway, that's what this language is. It's not any one particular party's language. It's trying to come up with something that reflects the comments and our, what we'd like to see in the rule. Okay, let's talk about the second item then. This was a suggestion that came in from Tacoma, Seattle, and Snohomish that we more explicitly provide for the use of integrated resource planning approach rather than the formula approach or the benefit cost test. I mean, people have different names for that. And it's an idea that I think was reflected a little bit in the rule already about at least sort of giving permission to do this analysis within an integrated resource planning process. But their suggestion that it be made more specific and sort of be put on par one with the other. So this is what we came up with. It's pretty similar to what the utilities suggested. And so if you have either concerns about the concept itself, or you want to talk about the specific language. Either way, feel free to comment. Rich thinks it's a good idea to do it. I can tell.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to
run the integrated resource plan.
Maybe just one observation. This is Rich. One observation is that it might be more difficult to prove the calculations, with this IRP approach than what we have done in the past. So, I just want to put that out there. I think with the modeling systems that would be used, that's a very different set of circumstances that would have to be reviewed by the state auditor, right?
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, that's my impression as well. I mean, I see a lot of benefit for going that direction, and I think it's actually more in line with how the council does it. I mean, I think that was the point you guys were making in your comment, was that that's kind of how it's done. That is the methodology, really, when you get down to it. But we also felt that there was value in the more formula approach, that not every utility wants to make that investment, and the timing is maybe not always right between their resource planning and their doing these conservation potential studies. So we didn't want to exclude the existing approach.
I think what you're offering here is similar to what we have written, and it's kind of, once you do your technical and your achievable, this is the way you get to your economic is what it means.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. This language would fit, would be placed in that section on the economic potential, and describe the two ways of getting to that. The one thing that I think we added in terms of a concept was the last sentence in the benefit cost ratio approach. Because as we were talking about this, after the comments came in, a concern that we've heard from some stakeholders has been that the cost, sort of the risk element of cost, which the integrated process is so, it's kind of designed to make a decision while incorporating risk and coming up with that least cost / least risk portfolio, that it may be hard for that to carry over to the formula and the inputs. And when you read the council's description of its methodology in Appendix G, you see that where they'll say, well, because we accounted for deferred generation over here and carbon costs over here, the model said there's no risk mitigation credit that needs to be applied. And we wouldn't, it seems like it wouldn't be quite right to say, well, okay, therefore, I should never have a risk mitigation credit. I can always leave that at 0, even if those other two variables, I'm going a different direction on those. So because of that concern that depending on the way a utility applied the formula, they might lose the risk concept, we wanted to more explicitly say that somehow in the combination of inputs, that formula needs to incorporate the risk that the utilities face. Does anybody on the phone want to comment on this one? Like Brendan or Wendy, I know both of you have had ideas on this point.
Yeah, this is Brendan in Seattle. I agree with Zach. I think that this is pretty good as written and aligned with our comments that we had on allowing the utilities the flexibility to choose the IRP approach if we feel that is best meeting our needs. So this looks good to me. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Brendan.
Yeah, and this is Wendy. I think this looks fine from our perspective as well.
Okay. Anything more on that particular item? Again, if you read it later and think it needs a little tweaking, there's one more opportunity for that. Okay, let's go to carbon emission costs. So basically the reason there's no language here is that at this point, our thinking is that the language that was in that second draft is good. That reflects the council's approach. I'm looking for that language here so that I can. Here we are. It's include the expected social cost of carbon emissions avoided. So, I think this is an area where we do have some difference of opinion, and I would open the floor to people who want to tell their side of the argument.
So, Glenn,
yes.
Two questions or two comments, maybe better to put. First, however we do handle carbon costs, I want to make sure that there's not double counting. So, to the extent that carbon creates a higher price for electricity in the wholesale market, I don't want to add on top of that, a carbon cost that doesn't reflect that delta that's already occurred. And the other question, and this is probably the most salient one from our perspective, is that when we take an action, for Tacoma and for our ratepayers. And so to the extent that an action we took could, through some modeling exercise, suggest that a carbon resource that we have no control over reduce their emissions. We don't want to have to count for that because that's not our resource. It's not something that we can control. We want to limit. We want to make sure that the things we do are limited to sort of within our boundary.
Okay. I mean, is there? I'm not sure I was quite following that second point about what you have in mind or the concern that you have there.
Well, I mean, since we're not quite, but let's just assume that we were 100% hydro. Mm-hmm. We would assign no cost savings to carbon reduction from any conservation measure we took because there's no, within our boundary, no change in carbon emissions. It's possible that outside of our boundary, because we consumed less, we sold a little bit more of our hydro to someone else who was able to back down a thermal resource. That's possible, but we have no control over it. We have no way of knowing if that's going to happen. We don't know if we're supplanting a wind resource or a carbon resource or what. So, but mostly it's one of fairness. You know, we're not responsible for the emissions in the first place. We shouldn't be charged, or we shouldn't have to do extra conservation because to help mitigate someone else's harm.
I think those aren't real carbon costs your ratepayers aren't necessarily burdened with. So saying that a unit of conservation saves them those societal carbon costs may not be appropriate in your utility-specific analysis. Now, to the extent that carbon costs affect the power price, and you've already reflected that, that's already accounted for.
Yeah, we already accounted for it there.
Yeah, I mean, in the scenario that you're describing, and just accepting it at face value, you're saying that it didn't, that there were no avoided emissions, and so.
I would say there were none within our service territory.
No emission costs for your ratepayers.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Right, and
I don't think that's quite right. I think what you're saying is that none of the resources you use to serve your customers, because you've got dams that aren't in your service territory that you rely on as part of your hydro system. So it's not in your service territory, but it's part of what supplies your power system.
Yeah, what I started off by saying, take for example the assumption that we were 100% hydro.
Yeah, right.
In that, and using that as the basis for the argument. No, there's our serving our customers have caused no carbon emissions to happen. Therefore, conservation doesn't change the fact that serving our customers causes no carbon emissions to be emitted.
And so just to elaborate on your scenario here, let's say you're 100% hydro and the only other source of power in the system is 100% fossil fuel. Then you do more conservation. Your hydro is not as much of it is used to serve your own customers. Where does it go?
I'm sorry.
Where does it go? What happens to your hydro if you're not using it to serve your customers?
We sell it.
So you're selling it to the only other entity in the system which operates fossil fuel plants. What do they do with their fossil fuel?
Well, presumably, this gets back to the point that Zach made, that the value of that hydro is slightly higher because of the carbon tax, whatever other controls there's on, which raises their avoided costs. And actually, that it raises our avoided costs too, assuming that we were going to use the market as our decision point. So, if in this scenario, we've already accounted for the cost of carbon through the avoided costs, the amount we're willing to pay to acquire conservation, and the amount we sell the power for. What I'm saying is there shouldn't be an additional cost saying, hey, there's an extra cost to the savings or extra value we should assign to the savings that we achieve, because I would argue that it's already been accounted for in the price of power that we're selling.
I would say as long as you're treating your supply side resource and your conservation resource with the same carbon price, as long as you're giving them the same carbon price, whether you use carbon price based on the societal cost of carbon or carbon price based on a potential carbon tax your utility wants to forecast, as long as you're treating them equitably. So you're not choosing a supply side resource, potentially a fossil fuel resource over a conservation resource. As long as you're treating them equitably, the absolute value you're using for conservation should be less of an issue.
There's a question on the phone.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Tom Schumacher. Ben, I just have a question in regards to the cost of carbon. Is that cost been determined? And how do you determine what the cost is? To who?
We're not proposing to set the cost of carbon in the rule. Their Power Council has used carbon cost estimates that were developed by the Environmental Protection Agency and a working group that they put together. I think those are not the end of the analysis about what carbon costs are. I'm sure we'll see more information on that going forward in the future.
Okay. So if we were to use the carbon cost to count, going into the formulas, then so are you thinking that we would want to need to use the cost that council used? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I think it'd be a decision point in your analysis, and I at least would hope that the that utilities wouldn't say, well, locally, there's no impact of carbon in the corners of my service area, because I think that's not consistent with the council's approach of looking at the overall effect of carbon emissions. But that doesn't mean that their number is absolutely the only number that could be used. I think one could reasonably come up with a different number that reflects the societal cost.
And I think my issue then would be using the societal cost, because that's potentially giving my ratepayers a cost and a benefit, cost and a benefit they may not actually accrue. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to say we're including all the benefits of reduced water usage in a high efficient laundry or washing machine, and reduced detergent usage, reduced power usage, because that's all accruing for my ratepayers. But to say I'm also going to save an extra, I forget what the name is, let's call it $50 a ton of carbon that may or may not accrue to that group of ratepayers seems the right comparison. And I think context matters. So if I'm using a zero carbon price, for example, and I'm saying, well, it looks like I need to build gas plants and no conservation, maybe using zero isn't appropriate. But if I'm saying if the carbon price doesn't change the amount of conservation targeting, I don't know the absolute value matters. Mm-hmm. So I think having language that says like carbon prices or a range of carbon prices is exceedingly fair. Locking in and saying you should only use a societal cost when modeling the potential carbon tax or modeling the potential cap and trade or modeling what you think the impacts of the clean power plant could be in the future would also be adequate or even more adequate than mm-hmm. societal cost.
And
so,
Glenn, go ahead. Is that Wendy?
Yeah, so the coalition has recommended that we think in this rulemaking it makes sense to specify that the social cost of carbon should be used, and I'll just give you our two rationale why for that. One is, that's what the council used. We think that's what is consistent with their approach. But the second one is the recommendation that came from Commerce to the state of Washington to actually use the social cost of carbon for state decision-making processes. And so we also think that recommendation is consistent with using a social cost of carbon for these purposes. So.
Thank you, Wendy.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to toss something in here.
Go ahead.
Thinking about
Dave Nightingale.
Thank you. Dave Nightingale, UTC. So, I mean, whether a utility has a carbon-generated resource or not, the effect of whatever carbon-generated resource will not just affect those customers. So, it's kind of irregardless, I think, in that sense. You can't control the carbon staying in your customer territory. It's a global, if not regional, maybe statewide issue. You know, it's at a macro level. You're not going to. So why should you try to artificially segregate the fact that carbon is being generated in that way as well? Just, you know, the physics of it don't add up to the favoring my utility doesn't generate any carbon or my utility generates a lot. It's really a regional impact or a global impact. So the costs are not borne by individuals, you can precisely quantify, but peanut buttered over the whole world, they're supposed to be appropriate. But I guess.
Hang on just a second. Can somebody on the phone, maybe one of the last speakers, check the mute button? We're hearing some noise. Thank you. Nicholas, you had a...
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I think that what we're talking about actually achieves what you're saying, which is that when we do a wholesale price forecast, we include a carbon cost. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, again, this is an example, we all agree on whatever that is. Well, in that situation, the wholesale power cost will be higher. Therefore, our avoided costs will be higher. And so we will acquire more conservation because we can sell the extra power for a premium so we will. So I guess my point is, the effect of the carbon is already being accounted for in the price that the avoided costs that we're using to establish the amount that's cost effective.
Yeah, so it seems like it's double counting the language.
Nicholas, you just said you were going to use your BPA contract price and not market price.
Which is even higher.
Well, I understand that it's higher right now, but what I'm saying is you said you can't argue that it's incorporated in market prices and at the same time say you're not going to use market prices. That's why, I mean, that it has to be explicitly included, because that's the whole point is to include it is consistent with the methodology as stated directly in Appendix G, and different utilities are going to use different values for these different inputs, so we can't assume that it's going to be covered by one of those inputs. If it is, then you can make some rationale about how it's incorporated with a different value that you're using when you do your calculations, but I think it needs to be explicitly in the rules that the carbon cost needs to be included.
I'm not arguing that you should not say in those rules that carbon costs need to be included. What I'm saying is the methodology for including carbon costs, to my way of thinking, for utilities like us, is that who are long and effectively carbon-free, will be reflected in our forecast of future wholesale power prices. Now, I agree with you that we're going to be using, at least for this go-around, a different number, because our avoided cost truly is EPA rates, which are higher than both the combination of wholesale power rates plus the carbon adder that we've had. So for us, we think we've already accommodated the price of carbon through choosing an even higher number. But from a pure methodological standpoint, what I'm arguing is that if you appropriately account for the cost of carbon in your wholesale power price forecast, and you have no carbon resources within your border, then I think you have accomplished the objective of appropriately accounting for the carbon costs.
I guess the question that comes to my mind is, so how do you determine if those forward prices of power have the appropriate carbon in there?
We do our own. We use the Plexus model. The people use the Aurora model, and it's a hourly dispatch model, and we include a carbon cost in that. Now, the second point, which we haven't gotten to, is what should that carbon cost be? And I'm not arguing that right now. I'm just put that aside for the second.
Assuming you crank in the right number.
Assuming we roll in the right number, then we should. we should have appropriately accounted for the question of carbon in our determination of the amount of cost-effective conservation to acquire.
And I think there's a set of inputs where that could be, where if what you plugged into the price forecast is the social cost of carbon and not some prediction about what a carbon tax might be at some point in the future. You know, because one of the things where this has moved over the last 5 years or so has been from, yeah, let's model the possibility that we might get tagged with a carbon tax, to now let's model this cost that we have high confidence society will incur, and so it no longer depends on either the what the political read about what the tax level might be or what the likelihood of that tax being imposed is. But so if you have actually plugged in to your price forecast the full social cost of carbon, then that might very well be all that you need to do. That seems like a possibility. I think also some other possibilities where market prices don't reflect the full carbon cost, and so in that case you'd need to do some more work to make sure you actually incorporated it. And we've looked a little bit at kind of the work behind what the Power Council has done at the national level, and from that we feel pretty confident that the idea that you need to look at both the effect on market prices and whatever is left, whatever isn't incorporated in market prices, in order to capture the full effect of carbon costs. And we feel like that's, so we wouldn't want to just omit this from the formula because it says somewhere else we're using market price. But we do think there's room for it to be addressed in more than one place in the approach.
Is there a way we can write this so that it's not a, so my concern is that it's going to be a point estimate. Use the societal cost of carbon as calculated XYZ. I think the more appropriate methodology would be use a range. It might be, let's make believe the social cost of carbon was levelized $50 a ton. That might be one number you might want to use. A carbon tax that's 25, and if they're giving you drastically different information and drastically impacting your conservation potentials, that's actually what you need to know. And how you set your individual targets based on those ranges and assumptions. Using that point estimate, use the societal cost of carbon is the part that I think, thinking for myself, I'm having.
Yeah,
that seems good.
And I think that, I mean, certainly if the utility is using the integrated resource planning, then need only look at how the Power Council did it, and you'll see that in that approach, there are a lot of different possibilities modeled for carbon costs along with the other uncertain variables. Excellent support for a utility choosing to do that same thing. It has to be a little harder to do if you're plugging in numbers to a formula because of the, then Jessica says, well, which one do I use as my avoided cost? Is it scenario A or scenario Z? You do have to come up with a number eventually. I agree with you about the range.
Then you're picking a number that you feel best balances costs and risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So we can pick a number once you've done the analysis to say, you have a really high carbon cost, you're doing a whole lot of conservation. If you have a more moderate carbon cost, you're doing 10% less conservation.
And that's a finding that the council made too. I mean, it's that difference between sort of a case with no explicit carbon cost versus the social cost of carbon didn't actually have a big effect on what's cost effective as a conservation resource and what's not. And that, I think, maybe gives people comfort about the...
Yeah, but I think forcing the methodology to say you must use this forecast or this assumption.
Okay.
Well, and actually, that just as a side note, I understand it was developed in 2007, and at some point they're going to revise it. So I think we kind of have to worry about the same issue we're worrying about now, which is the plan, the power plan, and those sorts of questions. But
I think they updated it in 13.
Yeah. Oh, they did.
I think so.
Oh, okay. Well, I stand corrected. But I just kind of want to get back to something I said at the beginning, just to make sure I've got clarity. Now with the passage of, or the adoption of technology, when we estimate, when we forecast energy prices, it's going to be a little bit higher. I don't know how much. And I just want to make sure that when we're talking about adding social cost of carbon, our forecasts aren't going to be on top of this new forecast, which includes carbon costs. We will take out that portion that's already covered under the clean air rule, and would only be based with delta, with social cost of carbon or whatever number we finally decide. Is that consistent with your?
I have no idea how. I mean, first of all, it's conceptually a little harder to model a quantity constraint than a price. If I say, oh, every ton that you emit, you got to pay $50, it's a little easier to track that through the forecasted price than if I say, well, you can't emit more than 5 million tons, for the state. How does that affect the market price, and to what extent is the market price, how much of the market price is due to that quantity constraint? I'm not saying it can't be estimated, but it's just a little harder for me to think about how to do it. And then, we'll end up, all of us, having to look comprehensively at how the Clean Air Rule is affecting these costs. Our ERUs, does conservation have a value because it can be monetized as ERU, or is there no value to that? Who knows how that's going to turn out?
Where is Northwest Energy Coalition?
I agree with you. There's almost like,
Nicholas.
How it's all. Hey, on the phone. Hello. We've got side conversations on the phone. We like to have all our side conversations in the room. You're welcome to join us here in the room. Thank you. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't have it in my head how the Clean Air Rule is going to incorporate, how it'll get incorporated into power sector costs, and whether there's anything left that has to be accounted for in the council's approach.
And I don't honestly know either. I am told that the Plexus model, the model that we use, and I think Aurora as well, includes the option of having annual total emission limits. And then they basically have an optimization routine that says, if with this constraint and 1,000 other ones, what's the optimal amount of, or what's the dispatch on an hourly basis throughout a 20-year period? Is it going to be perfectly accurate? No, I'm not even going to be close to suggesting that. But it would show a delta between including an emission limit and not including an emission limit. And that delta will go up. And I guess I'm just wanting to be really clear that that is a carbon cost because of the reduction in usage. And that carbon cost shouldn't be additive to social cost carbon. It should be a part of social cost carbon.
Yeah, and I agree with that completely. More thoughts on carbonated power? All right. Well, it's a great discussion. It's one that we're going to have a lot over the coming years. So I appreciate your thoughts on it. Let's go to the discount rate. And let's review the language in draft 2 on that point. Well, first let's start with what the existing rule says, and that is you use a weighted after-tax cost of capital for utilities and their customers. And what draft 2 said was the discount rate used by the utility in evaluating non-conservation resources. And Wendy, I'm going to let you start the conversation on this point because I know you have had some concerns about that.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just not understanding where you're seeing in Appendix G the justification for going to using the utility discount rate, because it seems pretty clear to me that the methodology laid out in Appendix G is a compilation of utility and customer discount rates that the council felt was reflective of the region, and so you know, in spirit of being clear that utilities can use their own, I think it makes more sense to allow the utilities to determine what makes the most sense in terms of what's the right discount rate for their service territory in terms of who's bearing costs and things going forward. What's the right discount rate for them to be using, and so in this sort of the same vein that the council did it, but from a utility perspective. And so I think that the language in the original rule actually reflects that better than the change that you've suggested.
So, Wendy, are you thinking that there could be the possibility that a supply side resource would be evaluated using a different discount rate than a conservation resource? Or I guess I'm not sure what you're...
Yeah.
So it might be that's the correct approach, is to discount those two differently.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, utilities are paying for the entirety of the supply side resource. That's not the case for energy efficiency resources generally. I mean, in some cases it is, in some cases it's not. And so I think that's one key difference.
This is Rich. I can't speak for other utilities, but for our utility, we use the same economic assumptions throughout the utility. It's a formal process, and so the same discount rates used for conservation are used for generation, are used for any other investment.
And if I could just add, this is Nicholas, also from Tacoma. It is my impression, and I have no data to support this, so I'm just being very clear, that the discount rate of our customers, the people who are also paying for conservation, is generally a lot higher than our own. And so if we were to use a reflective of them, I think that the very few things that had any kind of a long-term payback would ever become cost-effective. So, I think that this is a way to, more than anything else, increase conservation acquisition.
Well, Nicholas, I think what I'm trying to do is allow flexibility for different utilities to do it the way that they feel it makes most sense. And I think you are in one circumstance that isn't necessarily the same across the board for all utilities. And so, in a twist of irony, I am actually trying to give utilities more flexibility to do this in the way that they think it makes sense. I mean, conventional, the methodologies for energy efficiency in the papers and things that I've seen on utilizing appropriate discount rates clearly say that in the case of energy efficiency resources, it's different than supply side resources, because in some cases customers are bearing the majority of the cost, and so I just think it makes sense to allow the utility to assign what they feel is the appropriate discount rate depending on who's bearing the cost of those investments. And if Tacoma thinks that it makes most sense to have it be your utility cost of capital, then that's your decision. And I think the way that we're suggesting it be worded would still allow for that.
Okay.
Kevin Smith?
Yep.
Is that you playing the guitar?
With the guitar there. Yeah, no, it isn't. But
You're sounding pretty good if that's you.
yeah. I wish, yeah.
So, if you can...
Intentional.
It's tough to
I'm mute them all except for Kevin. Can
Right
you mute
on
them all?
your site there if you want.
Yeah, I can
Mute them all and unmute Kevin.
Kevin.
The one over.
Oh, that. Oh, I see. Right.
There we go.
Okay. Now, those of you on the phone, we have muted everybody, including the guitar player. And now I'm turning Kevin back on. Kevin, the reason I called on you is I thought it might be helpful for you to describe how the council comes up with a discount rate and how it addresses this question of whether different discount rates for different resources is appropriate.
So the first part of your question, there's a whole appendix A, I believe, that's dedicated to how we develop the discount rate. So I'm not sure I can summarize that concisely enough, but in the end, we ended up with a 4% discount rate that was just used for everything. So I'm not sure. I think what was said earlier about using the same for generation and conservation, that's basically what we do.
Okay.
Is that a good enough answer? I mean, I could probably get into some of the details, but basically we just, looked at a whole lot of things, different rates across the region and the country and so on, and basically it ends up being a policy call in the end of what discount rate to use. And we tested several different ones too.
Okay, thanks. And Rich, you had a comment? Or?
Well, I just want to say, just for reference, I mean, Tacoma is using on this current CPA 3%. And typically they're in that range.
Yeah. And Dave, are you still awake down there?
Barely hanging on.
Dave Nightingale, do you have on the top of your head how the UTC approaches the discount rate question?
I don't know if there's been a really hard definitive decision on that commission, but staff anyway are encouraging people to think really hard about just using council rate. So that would be the 4%. And I'm not sure exactly if all of them have done that in their current CPA or not. But that's
what we're most comfortable with.
I would observe that, customers, have generally a pretty high internal rate of return projects. We routinely see projects that, if it doesn't pay back in 1 year, your history. I mean, very often that happens in commercial industrial settings. So, if you want to go down the path of what our weighted discount rate is, fine. You're going to see the potential, the economic potentials drop precipitously, I think.
I would agree with that. It's Jessica at Snohomish. We see that frequently with C&I customers.
Yeah, just right on the Home Depot.
Okay.
I don't know.
That's gonna hurt conservation.
This is Glenn. One thing that I think sometimes gets lost in this discussion is the difference between financing costs and the discount rate. And my understanding of the council's approach is that when you're trying to come up with the costs of doing something, that it's definitely a legitimate thing to include financing costs to the extent those are going to be incurred. And, if you're talking about building a nuclear plant, then there's definitely going to be some financing costs that go into that, and those get incorporated in the cost of delivered energy from the nuclear plant. And on the conservation side, I think the council does at least a little bit of trying to model or think about how these things are typically paid for, the extent to which people pay for it out of pocket versus using a loan, and that varies some between residential and commercial and industrial customers. And, I think somebody made a written comment about this, that, if you could really get lost in trying to do that and never actually know how something gets financed. But at least in concept, there is the opportunity for a utility that wanted to do the work to dig in more on that sort of thing if they felt that it was significant. And that's something that hadn't been explicitly stated in the rule before, and it is in the draft that we have now, that the cost of financing measures is something that could be included. And if it is, then I hope there's not any dispute about the idea that it ought to be included at the financing cost of the person who's doing the financing. If the utility is borrowing money for it, then it should be their interest cost, and if it's a commercial customer, it ought to be their interest cost. But on the discount rate side, I mean, that's where you have figured out, okay, what are the out-of-pocket costs going to be over time, and then you're just trying to compute those into a single number so that you have 2016 costs on a comparable basis to 2030 costs. And my experience has been that the specific number, like I think Zach was saying, is as important as having consistency in your approach. And certainly the council's thinking about how they came up with a particular number is worth considering. But I don't, like Kevin was saying, there was a policy call, and so it does seem like there's a policy call to be made at other places too. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. And no one on the phone can object to what I'm saying. Sorry, Wendy. I tried to figure out how to turn only you on, but I'm not seeing you on the list of attendees. So
It could be the unidentified one.
Is there an unidentified one?
Yeah, scroll down.
Where did you sign in?
Right there.
Oh, no, that's GoToMeeting, Benton, PUD. Somebody just joined. I'm going to turn it back on again and see what happens. All right, is there anyone on the... Wendy,
this is
go
Wendy,
ahead.
and I think you can't find me because I called in using a phone number, so that might be the reason. But, you know, I mean, I think I've made our position on this clear, so I don't know that I have anything else to add.
Okay, thank you. I propose that we, well, kind of at that in-between time where do we take a break? I am planning for us to finish up by 3:30. Let me just, before we make that decision, the next item is the other items. What other items would people like to discuss? We maybe built a little agenda right here, then we could decide. Anything that people feel like needs to get hashed out in person we haven't hit yet?
How about the use of the formula?
The use of the formula. Say more about that, Larry.
Well, there was, I think we were talking last time about possibly putting that into the rules.
Yeah, right.
And so I don't know what you decide on.
Well, we haven't decided to include it, but I don't think we've made a final decision on that either way. I think we've gotten good comments from NWEC and from the utilities on that point. We are trying to make sure that all of the elements that feed into that formula are identified. And I think, I don't know, I guess I don't see a lot of value added if we are successful at that in including the formula itself, but it's not we're not completely settled on that yet. Okay, well, I think maybe we should just do a little bit of planning and then call it quits and not take a break right now. So,
Is that a vote, or is that what you're telling us you're doing? That's just a question.
I'm looking for, if people object.
Yeah. No,
But they're on mute.
we move on.
And we're no, everybody's off mute now. So.
Come on.
So on the second page of the agenda, you see the what the schedule looks like to wrap this up. What I'm intending to do is provide a fairly short turnaround where you see a draft and you get a few days to look it over, and at that stage, you know, you can both try to, you know, make big policy points that you want to, but you also could say, well, okay, if you're going that way, then here's, you know, you ought to do it, you ought to say it a little differently or something like that, kind of the fine-tuning type comments. And then, so our objective is to have those comments back to us by the end of the month, and then we would start that formal part of the rulemaking process where we file a proposed rule and it's published in the state register, and then on and then at that point I didn't put that in here, but there'd be opportunity for written comments on the proposed rule. Those would be due basically on the same day as the public hearing on November 16th. The public hearing is where you can come and actually testify in a more formal setting. And then our plan is to try to wrap this up, get the rule adopted by the end of November. It would then become effective a month later, and the project would be over.
Completely.
As defined, yep. And, you know, so it's one reason why we would like to go ahead and get this wrapped up is we do want to give the planners, you know, as much time as possible for the next round of conservation potential assessments. We don't want to have this going on when people are trying to do their work. So that's why we're trying to get it done by the end of this year.
Actually, that does bring up a question. We're in the middle of doing our conservation potential assessment, and I don't have to look. I can't speak for Rich. He knows more about it all than I do. But just say, for the sake of argument, that there's one fundamental difference where we are halfway done doing that plan and what the rule is. Is there sort of an expectation that we would stop and start over, or is, you know, if you're well down the path, that it's just something you would deal with in the next iteration? So I guess, you know, you say the effective date is December 31, but, you know, we probably have another 2 months before the CPA is supposed to be finished, and we started in June.
Mm-hmm. Well, why doesn't Rich just finish it before December 31st?
Brilliant. Yeah.
That works for me. I'll bring the cards.
I have
So you know, let's see, the conservation target will be adopted at the end of 2017, right? Am I right about that? So that's the one that, according to these rules, needs to be based on a conservation potential assessment that is performed consistent with the 7th power plan. And so I think that this rule would apply to the targets adopted at the end of 2017.
Just to be clear, the challenge with that is that the reason why our timing is such as it is because all the information in the CPA flows into the IRP, which we will do.
It's a year-long process.
Which is a year-long process, and we can't not do an IRP, and it takes the full year to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a challenge, for lack of a better word, to if there. I don't even know if there's any inconsistency. So this may be a totally moot point, but if there is an inconsistency, it would be very difficult to figure out how to correct it and not really throw off everything else that we scheduled and are undergoing. It is what it is.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I'm not expecting that there will be an inconsistency. And this ultimately would be a call that the auditor would make about, you know, which rule applied. But, you know, if there's something specific you want us to try to do to anticipate that, if it turns out there's an actual concern here, then we're willing to help.
Yeah, that's something we can try to figure out before the next round of public comment. So we'll look into it.
Okay. Any questions? Others? Questions about the schedule or what they should wear at the hearing on the 16th?
You're going to be here.
It'll be here in this building. Okay, well, the schedule says to adjourn by 3:30, so let's wait 27 minutes. For David.
Or not. Yeah, I've got a note.
Okay. All right, let's call it good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the discussion. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah. Actually, both phones are left.
Uh-oh. Are you going to talk to Alice? What are they going to